Well, welcome class back to our macroeconomics. Again, this your next video. First of all, I want to apologize to you. I had two laptops, both went out on me. I had one in the shop, and I just getting the other one repaired. And I have been remiss in some of my emails to you. I will correct that in the next few days. I apologize. Anyway, we'll be moving forward with these videos, and I have a few other videos that you might enjoy that I probably am going to be loading in the coming modules. But today we're going to talk about, well, we'll finish up. We were talking about elasticity, and the more vertical the line, whether it's supply or demand, the more inelastic it will be, whether it's supply or demand. The more horizontal, the more movement, more response you're going to get. Now, why was that important? Well, it's important for business. It's important for governments to know how much a response they're going to get if they need something from a certain industry. And it's important for taxation because the government needs to know, what is the right amount to tax. Now, as we said before, markets are typically efficient and they do move towards equilibrium. However, markets can fail. We'll get into that in just a minute. But basically, as you can see, when you look at how much is too much tax, well, government does need some funds, so it has to do some taxing. But we know in doing that, it's taking away money from you and I, either proportionately from the suppliers and the demanders, if both the supply and demand curve have the same elasticities, or if one or the other curve is more inelastic, they will bear more of the burden of the tax. All right? So, in this, though, when we see taxing, we have that black wedge, which is dead weight loss. Nobody gets it. All right? In our first example, this taxing this much and creating that much dead weight loss probably isn't enough to support our government. All right? Then you go to the other extreme, and this is probably way too much. Huge, dead weight loss. So it's just here in the third example, you've got that just right Goldilocks position where you're taxing just enough to support government activity, yet not too much that you're going to kill industry. Arthur Laffer came up with the Laffer curve, which comes out, if this is the tax rate and this is the total government revenue, it's showing that government revenue will go up as the tax rate goes up, but it will hit a certain point where it's counterproductive, meaning the tax rate is so high that people just are cutting back on their working. They're not going to produce if the rates are too high, which will give us a backward bending Laffer curve, okay? So obviously, taxation is something the government needs to do, and it will affect the market. Now, there are other factors to look at when we think about government meddling in the market. And those are the three primary ones that we're going to look at is price ceilings, price floors, and quotas. Now, we have quotas because those are important too. The price ceilings and price floors are controls on the price by the government, all right? Quotas is more of a quantity control, but it still will affect the market, all right? So, that's our little introduction here, and we'll get right to our first whiteboard. which is government intervening in the market, all right? Well, got a little smudge here. Now, these will be important. I almost guarantee they will be a major discussion question, all right? So, we start out by saying generally the market is efficient and it does move towards equilibrium. As we talked about earlier in the other week, we were talking about, surpluses or shortages, and market pressure will bear either bringing us back down to equilibrium or bringing us back up to equilibrium, all right? But the market can fail. It is possible that the market can fail, okay? Typical examples of market failure would be, for instance, monopoly type pricing. I don't know if any of you have need of, hopefully not, but an EpiPen. Well, those EpiPens, when they came out, they had that market pretty well cornered. And interestingly enough, from the year 2007 to the year 2016, EpiPen raised their pricing 548%. I mean, it was a huge, huge increase, okay? Now, something like that, or for instance, a Martin Shkreli taking over Turing Pharmaceuticals and just skyrocketing the price, those are situations where we need some kind of government intervention, all right? That's one. Number two would be something like pollution. In general, we can't allow factories, if we go back 100, 150 years ago, they were, dumping everything they could in the air and into the streams, but they were out to, again, maximize their profits, all right? So pollution is a classic example of market failure. Market by itself allowing producers to pollute water and air. We need government intervention. Third classic example would be some goods just are not made, are not best suited for the private sector. And what I mean by that is, for instance, national defense. Now, national defense sounds good, and we have a lot of private companies that supply, the Defense Department with all the things that they need. But national defense per se is not an item that is best suited to the private sector. Why? Because if there was a huge contract to give to a major defense contractor, let's say $3 trillion, take over national defense, the problem is the government couldn't guarantee who was going to make the payments, because some folks don't pay their taxes. So the government's saying to the private sector, well, here's this big contract, but we can't guarantee you're going to get paid. That would take it out of the private sector and put it more into the public domain, the public sector. So we need some government action, okay? And here's we got price ceilings, price floors, and quotas. All right, price ceiling. And again, with ceilings and floors, they go exactly the opposite of where you normally would think a ceiling or a floor should go. All right, when you think of a price ceiling, you immediately think of something up there, and a price floor, you naturally think of something down below that you're walking on. All right. Now, in the marketplace, theoretically, you may put a price ceiling or a price floor anywhere you want. But to be binding, to be effective, a price ceiling has to be below equilibrium, all right? The price ceiling is an upper limit that the price can go. It's the upper limit that a price can go. Now, normally, if we had this scenario as we saw before, we said, well, market pressure is going to build and it's going to bring us back up to equilibrium. In this case, it can't, because the government has stopped it right here. And we'll go through this in a minute, okay? But remember, a price ceiling to be effective has to be below equilibrium. You can put a price ceiling above it, but it's not going to do anything, all right? Now, classic example again is New York rent controls. Started pretty much with World War II. Government was afraid that with all the folks flocking to the big cities, to New York, Washington D.C., Philadelphia for jobs in the War Department or some kind of defense related job, there were going to be all these folks coming to the big cities, and the landlords were really going to take advantage of it and just skyrocket the rents. So rent control was born, and the government came in, locked in the amount that landlords could charge. Now, in New York City, a lot of the rent controls, they are still, believe it or not, they are still in effect. Now, what does that do? Well, let's say, and I know these numbers are not accurate because you're going to say, well, you can't really get a decent apartment for $1,500 in New York, but just go with this example, right? So let's say this is the graph for apartments in New York. We have the supply and demand, and we see they meet, we're at $1,500. So the equilibrium price is $1,500. Now, at that equilibrium price, we have an equilibrium quantity of 3 million apartments that are wanted, all right? However, with a price control, and remember, it's got to be below equilibrium. So for this case, let's say the rent control is $800, all right? What does that do? Well, as we bring it across, we see, well, it hits the supply curve here, which isn't very much, but we keep going, it hits the demand curve way over there, which is a lot, okay? Now, you'd say, initially, you'd say, well, in our previous discussions, well, we've got this big shortage, and in this case we do. We have 4 million apartments wanted, but only 2 million are being supplied. So we'd say, well, you've got a 2 million apartment shortage. Now, what happens is, though, that since it is government mandated, it can't go above the price ceiling. So here's what we have. We have, and this actually does, I had friends who had families, they have beautiful apartments that have been under price controls for years. And you look at it, it's so unfair because some of these folks who can really afford, an expensive apartment, they're paying just about, pennies on the dollar, just about, for these beautiful places. So there are a number of, problems with price ceilings, which you're going to need to remember. All right. Number one, obviously, reduces the quantity below efficient levels. Because we are only 2 million are being supplied, okay? Normally the market would correct the shortage, but in this case it can't, okay? Now, we have examples in Venezuela. They have shortages all over the place. They might put in not a rent control, but perhaps a control on how much a certain amount of food can be charged, and they're going to keep the price of food way, way, way down low. Well, initially to the people that sounds wonderful. I mean, cheap food sounds like a great idea. However, when you go to the other side of the coin and you go to the producers, they're not so thrilled about this. So they're not going to be producing all that much food at this really low price, or perhaps they can't. What they might do is they might switch, instead of growing food for people, they might just invest in some kind of crop that they feed hogs or something. the long and the short of it is, there's just a huge shortage, okay? Tremendous shortages of bread. That's why they're overturning bread trucks in Venezuela. Huge shortage, okay? Now, number two, misallocation of goods. That would be an example I just mentioned. Folks who are fairly well off or very well off, they might have apartments that have been rent controlled for years. They can easily afford more, but they don't have to because it's under rent control. However, if you and I moved to New York and you got a family and you got a job in New York and you actually need a decent apartment and you deserve an apartment, you can't find one. So it's very difficult. So that's a misallocation of goods. They're giving the bigger apartments to folks who don't really need them and could easily afford more, and the folks who do need them either can't find them or they have to pay a tremendously high price for what they get. All right, that's a misallocation of goods. Wasted resources. That would be all the time and effort and energy that you spend running around, if you've ever done this, trying to find a place to live that you can afford. Okay, that would just be one example. You're spending time, effort, energy, and money trying to find a place that is just right for you. That's a lot of wasted resources, okay? Number four, inefficiently low quantity, all right? This has to do with, let's say you have a building that is rent controlled, okay? You're the owner now, though. All right, what are you trying to do? What is your position? Well, your position is you would love those folks to move out, because when they move out, then you can afford, you can finally raise the rent. The rent control will come off, all right? So you are not going to be keeping that building in perfect shape. You may not paint the building for quite a while, or if one of your tenants calls that the hot water heater went out, you say, oh yes, we're going to get to it. Our handyman is not here today, but you're not going to rush to replace the hot water heater or any of the other services that they need. In other words, the building is going to look somewhat shabby because you would love them to move out, all right? So what happens, the long and the short of it is, we have inefficiently low quality of product, all right? And the last one is black markets. Now, technically, if you have an apartment, let's say you have an apartment in New York that's rent controlled, and you got it for a really low price, and you want to move to Florida for maybe a year or two. Well, you're not supposed to do this, but it happens all the time. You may sublet your apartment for a price quite a bit higher, yet still lower than what the going rate is. So the person you're subletting the apartment to is getting a deal. You're making out because you're picking up even extra money, and then you can see what life is like down in Florida for a couple of years, and if you move back, no harm done. Now, subletting under rent controls is not legal, but this rent control situation will lead to a lot of illegal activity, okay? So you're going to need to remember those five. Price gouging laws, well, that's like a temporary price ceiling. In your book, and in a lot of books, they'll talk about, selling generators. Folks, when there was a hurricane, they were thinking of finding a spot way up north that had a supply of generators, buying them, bringing them down south, and then selling them for a huge profit. All right, that's called price gouging. Now, there are price gouging laws, but in the long and the short of it is, it actually just reduces the quantity available, because the people who were willing to spend, $300, $400, $500 extra, that's just it. They are willing to spend the money, but they can't because the generators aren't available. So there's It just reduces the quantity available, and it also kills incentives, all right? But the main thing I want you to remember is these 5 problems with the price ceilings. Now, again, you can put the price ceiling above equilibrium, but if you do, it has no effect. It's not binding, all right? What I mean by that is if the equilibrium price for an apartment was $1,500 in New York, and you put the price ceiling above the equilibrium, say $2,000, it doesn't mean anything because, you know, at $1,500, everybody's happy. We got the quantity supplies equal to the quantity demanded. You know, folks are renting out, you know, apartments left and right at $1,500, no problem. So if the government comes in and says, oh yes, well you can't charge more than $2,000. Well, that really doesn't really make even much sense to you because you're saying, well, don't worry about it. I'm not going to charge more than $2,000. I'm at $1,500 and we are, you know, renting out all the apartments we can get. So any price ceiling, remember it's an upper limit of the price. If you put it above equilibrium where you think a ceiling should go, you can do that, but it's not going to have any effect. So they call that non-binding. So to be binding, the price ceiling has to be below the equilibrium price. Okay? When you think about it, it just makes sense, but when you first see it, hear of the ceiling and the floor, you think of the ceiling being up there and the floor being down below. Okay? All right. So that takes care of price ceilings. Hang on for 1 second.